Reading with your kids.
Hola, ni hao, konnichiwa, bonjour, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, moni muli wanji, namaste, jambo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jedley, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We are coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. Thank you so very, very much for being part of our mission to help families grow closer together by reading. Please be sure to connect with us on social media, facebook.com/readingwithyourkids, at Jedley Magic on Twitter, at Reading with Your Kids on Instagram. Our guest today is returning to the show. It's Jessica Laurel Kane. She is here to celebrate Anchors in the Storm. If you were listening to the Reading with Your Kids podcast at the end of 2020, you heard us celebrate our virtual family literacy fair, Reading in the New Year. It was a fantastic success. We were really gratified by how many families came out to our virtual stage where they were able to watch magical performances, hear inspirational messages about the importance of reading, and hear hours and hours of authors reading their books aloud for your family. We've decided to replicate that, but not on a global basis like Reading in the New Year. No, we would love to create a virtual literacy fair for your community. That's right, for your school, for your church group, or just like a whole bunch of friends in a neighborhood. We'd love to do it for you. Please go to our website, readingwithyourkids.com. Click on the Parents Click Here button at the top of the page. Scroll on down to where it says Live Events. We'd love to see you in your community. Joining us right now from upstate New York. She is returning to the show to celebrate her brand new picture book called Anchors in the Storm. Please welcome back Jessica Laurel Kane. Jessica, how are you?
Thank you, Jed. I'm fine. So nice to be here again.
Nice to have you back. We had a really fun conversation not too long ago about a couple of your other books, A Book of Hearts and The Girl Who Was Born with Glue on Her Brain. I just love that title.
Thank you.
And excited to have you back for Anchors in the Storm. Tell us all about this book, please.
Well, I've been thinking of writing a book to help families and children during times of loss and grief. Back in 2016, when my mother suddenly passed, and then 6 months later that same year, my husband's mother passed unexpectedly. So we had two big unexpected deaths in the family. And my son, who was 4 at the time, had never obviously been involved in a discussion like that or an experience like that. So I'd been thinking in my head, I planted a seed to write a book based on what I'd learned talking to my son, because we wound up having really profound conversations about the meaning of life from those incidents. And then when COVID happened, several friends of mine lost loved ones from the virus, and other tragedies that happened while in quarantine. And a dear friend of mine had a horrible tragedy in her family, and I was so heartbroken for her 2 girls that one night, very late at night, that book, the text came out in the form of a poem for those girls, for my dear friend's daughters. And that then became what I illustrated to make Anchors in the Storm.
Wow, such profound moments. As you were talking about the loss of your mom and your mother-in-law and dealing with your son at that time, it reminded me of the time when I lost my mom, and then my father-in-law passed very shortly, and they both had very long, and it wasn't unexpected at all, but it was very long and difficult periods of suffering for both of them. And my kids were older than your son was at the time, but they were still young. They were in middle school, starting high school. And one of the things that made it so difficult was that nobody else wanted to talk about it. You know, the other members, because it was such a long and drawn out process, you know, there are lots of decisions to be made, and there weren't a lot of people wanting to step up and help in that decision-making problem. They were there to support me all the way. Whatever I decided, they were going to back me up 100%. And that was appreciated, but it wasn't really what I was looking for at the time. And my kids were, you know, because they needed to deal with it and I needed to deal with it, that time that we spent talking about it was really important. I kind of wish I had a book like Anchors in the Storm to kind of sit down, and even though the kids were older, I think it would have been a great way to start some of those conversations.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because I feel like your situation and my situation is such a common situation that we don't know about because of what you were saying, that people are uncomfortable talking about this subject. And I think that was my main goal, not to have a book that makes everything okay, but to make a book that would be the icebreaker for people to have those conversations. I wanted to open the door just a crack to let people know that it's okay to be sad. It's okay to be confused, not only because you've lost somebody, but because you start to think about the fact that we are temporary people. And what does that mean about who we are? What does that mean? How do we put that in context for what our lives mean? And huge questions that people don't want to talk about. In fact, I find it interesting because with what's going on in the world today, a lot of people are having a conversation about what's appropriate to bring up with our children. And I think about so many times when there's a difficult conversation, parents do probably what I did, which was pop in Boss Baby or pop in some Disney movie because it's easier. It entertains the children. And then the funny thing about my child is he's very disturbed by all the distraction devices. He doesn't like those movies. In fact, he finds moments in those movies where people are covering each other's mouths or kicking each other and laughing. He's tuned into disturbing things. So I wasn't able to distract my son with things like that, and he insisted that I talk to him about what's real. And that's what kind of broke the ice for me, because my distraction devices weren't working for him. He was more disturbed by that. And he said, I want to know what's going on. Why do people die? Where do they go? Are there stores in heaven? Do they get groceries there? How many people live in heaven? Because there's been a lot of people alive on earth. Can you look up, Mama, how many people have been alive? How do they have maps in heaven? How do they know where they live? So he's asking all these different questions. And of course I have no distractions now. So we're going to have this kind of conversation. And then we just started talking and talking. And we still talk. It's an ongoing conversation.
Well, it really is. And it should be. I know I got a lot of not so much grief, but a lot of questions because we didn't, when I was growing up 100 years ago, you didn't talk about death. You know, I think the first funeral or wake that I went to, the first death that was actually like acknowledged in my family was my grandfather when I was 16. And, you know, before that, there were obviously people who passed. In fact, one of our neighbors, 4-year-old, drowned. But we didn't talk about it. He was like, yep, that happened. Okay, stop. And watch TV. You know, and my kids we dealt with it in the opposite way. If there was somebody that passed, our kids went to the funerals when they were young, and we had these discussions because I didn't want them kind of feeling left out and having all these questions unanswered the way that I grew up.
Yeah, I like that. It is so interesting, and I can relate to that myself. People really did not speak about difficult situations in my childhood either. It was handled, it was really avoided, so that my personal experience was to assume that I needed to deal with difficulties by myself and make sense of it by myself. And it did limit the connections that could have been possible.
Yeah, that's a really powerful observation that you made, that when our kids are going to have to deal with it anyways. I was well aware that 4-year-old neighbor of mine passed away, that he drowned. All of us in the neighborhood were aware of it, but we had to deal with it and process it ourselves. And that's something that most kids aren't able to do very well.
I think that's really the theme of my book, is about what life is about, and it's about connection, making connections. And each person who is alive right now has an opportunity to build such connections with people so that when they do pass, we've internalized those connections, and those connections remain. And one of the ways those connections can be made profound are speaking about passing, speaking about the temporariness of life. And I think that's the main thing that my book's about, and the main thing that I got out of speaking to my son, and also remembering my mother, because we didn't talk so much about death, but we did talk about everything else. And I always felt like she had kind of interrupted my life a lot of times with calling or wanting to talk about this and that. And it wasn't until after she passed that I realized that those moments of connection are what lasts after she has passed. So I've internalized all those moments. I hear her in my heart. And that then made me realize that having these conversations with my son are the connections that are so profound, that will stay in his heart. Whereas the people who I didn't really connect with profoundly, the conversations we missed, we'll never be able to have those. And the connection isn't as deep with them gone. So I think that's the main theme of my book, is about connection and how those connections really do last in eternity, and how the book maybe can be a conversation piece to help families have those kinds of conversations that lead to those connections.
I like that. As you were speaking, I had this thought: there are so many people who are afraid to make connections because they realize that at some point relationships end because of a multitude of different reasons. And of course one of them is because somebody dies, and so we don't want to get hurt. We don't want to risk that future hurt, and so we don't make the connections. And I think your book is telling us we should be thinking the opposite. It's like, yeah, it is going to hurt when that person leaves our lives, but the memories, the connections that we make can help us get through that sorrow and can stay with us for a lifetime.
Absolutely. And not to mention that if you can, sometimes I remember the context of life as a continuation. So really we are continuing ourselves and the people who came before us through sharing those connections. And the connections are the links that keep us connected, not only to each other, but people who came before us. And for me, it makes the whole process of death, it is profound in its sadness and grief and the surreal qualities of being temporary. But it also is the thread to make some sense out of it, about the importance of continuing and the importance of sharing and how each person has something so profound to connect and share with and contribute to the next person, whether we're related or not.
The title, and as I mentioned at the outset of the show, you have a real gift for titles. Anchors in the storm. Is the anchor in our storm? Is it the connections that we make?
Yes, absolutely. Because when you're just letting yourself be blown by circumstances, I can see in my mind like a little leaf. It's blown when the winds are high, and then when the winds die down, it's left alone. But when you're a person and you choose to have an anchor of connection, an anchor in the perspective of where you're looking from, that anchor is not just something to hold on to make yourself feel better. It actually does anchor you in a place and time, in a context, in a perspective. It's real.
Yeah. I'm imagining that there might be one or two people listening to this and listening to the conversations that you had with your son and hearing those questions that he asked you, and just feel panic and not hear in your voice the fact that was a really profound, loving moment. And while, yeah, you weren't happy that you suffered this loss, you loved that your mom was still here, but I'm guessing that you wouldn't trade that time and those questions. You don't wish that he didn't ask those questions.
Well, I should tell you a little bit about what happened.
Okay.
Before my mother passed, I very much shied away from these conversations. In fact, my son asked me if he would be dying one day, and I was so uncomfortable that I just said no. I actually lied to him because I was that uncomfortable. So this was a really big deal for me to have two people pass. And I'll never forget that morning when I found out, and I was in a state of shock and tears. And my son asked me what's wrong, and I didn't tell him. And he, to this day, tells me that he's still upset about that. So he was very upset with me because we are very close. We've always been by each other's side every second. And that was a really scary moment, he told me, because I was visibly the most upset he'd ever seen me. And then I said nothing was wrong. So we had a lot of repair work to do. Because I didn't want to break his heart to tell him that his grandmother had died, and I didn't want to break his heart to tell him that he was going to die one day. So this was a conversation that came out of me being so uncomfortable and so unfamiliar with these conversations.
But it just shows you how important these conversations are. Because unlike me, your son had the courage or the wherewithal or the grit to say, nah, you're not telling me the truth. I know that there's something wrong here. What's up?
Yeah, and you know what's so funny? Once I told him the truth about life and we talked about it, and my words were, it's, you know how when you talk sometimes and your words come out of your mouth and you think, my goodness, I just learned something from myself. It was one of those profound experiences where somewhere in me I knew the wisdom of explaining that things pass and all of that stuff. But he was, at a young age, he was much more comfortable with it than I had been. And he said to me, please don't ever not tell me the truth again. I can handle the truth. So really, he wants to know the truth. It was my issues with my needing to sort out what my life was all about. Not just my agendas, my hopes and aspirations, but something that included those who have been and those who will be. And because of so much dysfunction in so many of our families, I think we have so much to prove for ourselves, for our own lives to have meaning, that we forget that it actually has to do with something equally, if not more profound.
Boy, yeah, one thing that I always, if a young parent ever asks me for advice, I always let them know, be honest with your kids. If you can find a ladder to climb off that pedestal that your kids put you on thinking that you are perfect, get off that pedestal as soon as you can and let your kids know that you make mistakes, that you hurt, that you're imperfect.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I'm really happy that you had the courage to share with us today that, in your experience, you weren't, the wise oracle who knew exactly what to do when this happened, and you didn't know all the perfect words, and actually you made a mistake with your son and lying to him at first, because, again, I think it's that just reminding parents that we are human. And we do make mistakes, and we don't want to make mistakes, but we're going to make mistakes, and we can fix it when we do make mistakes.
Absolutely. And also getting to know my son and the kinds of conversations he's interested in having. And then we had to go through all of the rigmarole because he wanted to know every single thing that I ever told him that wasn't completely true blue. So that was the year that the Tooth Fairy and the Easter Bunny and Santa Claus, because he turned out to be the kind of child who wants facts. Mm-hmm. He wants the real deal. He wants to know what is going on. Mm-hmm. And he was very upset about Santa Claus to begin with. And so he was very relieved to know that wasn't real. But you know what? Some people talk about magical thinking. I've discovered through my son that the magic that he's interested in is how does a seed turn into a tree? Like, he's so excited about that. He doesn't need some guy coming down the chimney. That's really weird and creepy to him. He wants to know, like, how do we think? How does our brain tell our foot to move? Mm-hmm. How does time move on? So he's finding the magic based in reality and wanting to understand that more.
Yeah, that's something your son sounds like I would love him. And one of the things that I'm, because I do educational magic shows, kids will come up to me and they'll go, wow, where'd you get your magical powers? And how does that happen? And all that. And I always, refer back, and all these kids are taking pictures of me with this little device that they have in their pocket that allows them to communicate with people all around the world and take videos and pictures. And I'm like, dude, that thing that you have in your pocket, that's magic. And it's not just the ability of the thing, it's the teamwork, the thousands and millions of people who work together to make that thing work so that you can run around with it in your pocket and make dumb TikTok videos. I'm just making that. An egg appear out from whatever place I was hiding it in, Yeah.
But I love both of that. I love that you gave them that context too. That's magical as well.
Yeah, it is amazing when we are open to all the magic that's around us, and even those conversations that you are having with your son. They're a type of magic in that you love your son loves you, and you think, wow, this is amazing, and I've never felt so close to a person in my life. And then you go through something and you find out, wow, this love, this relationship can go even deeper than I imagined.
Yes. Yeah, yes.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. You've had a really fascinating career as an artist, not only as an illustrator of children's books and a writer of children's books. You're a sculptor. You're a makeup artist. What kind of art have you not created that you're looking forward to creating in the future?
Well, it's funny you say that. What I've always wanted to do for so long is have a radio show, a podcast. That's been this dream of mine, and I've always I always give up because I get nervous. So that's something that I've been wanting to do for such a long time because it's so fun talking with people, but I've not done it.
Well, we're going to inspire you to do that because I think a podcast from Jessica Laurel Kane would be amazing.
Oh, thank you, Jed. Well,
Jessica,
that's really sweet.
Jessica, where can folks go to connect with you and find out more about your art and about your books?
Well, my website is www.jessicalaurelkane.com, and of course my books are on Amazon. And I have an Instagram account, Jessica_Laurel_Kane, Kane. And I'm very active on my personal Facebook page. I guess those are the main areas that I share my stuff on.
Wonderful. Well, we're really excited. And we're really excited to have you back to celebrate your next book whenever that's available. We're also very excited at someday, hopefully, being invited to be on your podcast.
Oh, you are so sweet. Thank you so much, Jed. It's always so fun talking with you.
We've had a great time talking to the author of Anchors in the Storm, Jessica Laurel Kane. Hey, Jessica, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Jed. Have a good day.
Please be sure to join us for the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. Our guest will be Marie Arnold. She'll be here to celebrate the year I flew away. That is the next episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. Hey, if you are looking for a great podcast to listen to with your kids, check out the Solve It for Kids podcast. You can find myself and our Dean of all things STEM and STEAM, Jennifer Swanson, speaking to oceanographers, nuclear physicists, astronauts, aquanauts, so many amazing guests. You want to check it out. You can find the Solve It for Kids podcast on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. You can also find us at the website, solveitforkids.com. Want to thank the folks who made today's show so very wonderful. Of course, want to start by thanking our guest, Jessica Laurel Kane. Please be sure to check out Anchors in the Storm. Also want to thank my team, Alejandra Doherty, Fatima Khan, our amazing interns, Alexia Brown and Hannah Pat Oboyski. Also want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. Most of all, is that the way it is? Most of all, I want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.